the Goot Reaction. It's October 31st today, and with me, as always, is my main man from the Midwest. And we're going to talk a little bit about the election today. We figured it's only less than a week away now, and one of the primary topics that we cover is politics. So why not dive into the election a little bit, just discuss some of the polls, some of the trends, get into that a little bit. And then I wanted to reference an article I wrote on my Substack, thegootreaction.substack.com, where I talk about the costs of Trump when he was in office, and then even some things out of office as well. But generally, the 4 years that he had running our country, and some of those hidden costs that we don't normally think about. So just as a final heads up on what those years were really like, and to try to dispel some of the nostalgia over those 4 years for anybody wondering. So let's get going then. My data here that I'm looking at is from 538, and so there are a number of different ways to look at aggregated polls, but rather than look at a bunch of different ones, I figured this is a good place to start. So let's just start at the national polling, and this is an aggregate of all the national polls right now. And we have, as of today, Harris up by 1.2%, with Harris at 47.9 and Trump at 46.7. And kind of the one thing that's notable about this chart that I'm looking at is that they were tied back in August, the start of August. And then Harris started to grab a pretty significant lead, and I think that's when she was really pushing a populist message, and that she was the candidate of change. She was at one time up by more than 3 percentage points going into September, and then as of mid-September, that lead started to shrink a little bit, and Trump's been kind of going steadily up over time, where Harris kind of plateaued in the beginning of October at about 48.6% to Trump's 45.9 on October 1st. And then, like I said, over the last month, so that was a 2.6% lead for Harris then, and then now it's only 1.2. So I think, in my opinion, and I'm definitely not a pollster here, but in my opinion, part of what that's about is those nascent Trump voters starting to be more represented in the polls. I don't think that's necessarily a swell of support for Trump that wasn't there before. I think that's just more of that showing up. And you know how we had a lot of closeted Trump voters in 2016 that weren't really comfortable saying how much they wanted to support him until the very last moment in the end when they voted for him. I think we're starting to see that come out a little bit more now, and I think that's part of the reason why that gap's closing. I also think it could be partially how Harris has been going after the centrists, going after disaffected Republicans, never Trumpers, those types of people, Haley voters. In towards middle to late September, she started switching her message to be more pro-corporate, having Mark Cuban go out on the stump for her, things like that, really pushing for those disaffected Republicans. And so, while I'm not sure that that's not a good part of a strategy to have, it feels like they kind of went all in on it, campaigning with Liz Cheney a lot, Charlie Sykes. And while I appreciate them speaking out and being willing to endorse Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, I think at the end of the day, that was an interesting shift in campaign tone, going away from that more populist message to one of centrism, and having neocons like Dick Cheney and Kermit the Frog, or Tim Bolton, as I call him, or John Bolton, sorry. Having people like that endorse and push for Harris is not concerning necessarily, but just a different tone. So I think that's part of the reason why that gap is closing right now. But as of now, like I said, Harris still has that 1.2 percentage point lead. Looking at a little bit of other data, do Americans have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of Donald Trump? Right now, he's 52% unfavorable, 43% favorable. And Kamala Harris her unfavorables have come down and her favorables have gone up recently. So whatever she's doing basically since she launched her campaign, it's made a huge difference. So this chart goes way back, and only at the last little bit here shows quite a significant movement. But that's when she pretty much got in the race in late July. So her unfavorables are 48% to favorable 46%. So she's only underwater by plus 1.6%. And like I said, Trump is negative 8.7 right now. So just in terms of favorable, unfavorable, that's definitely a positive for Kamala there. And then I thought this was interesting too, a little bit, because a lot of times you hear the argument about people may not like Trump, but they like his policies. And so that's where that kind of magical Venn diagram of like Nikki Haley voters comes in, where they still like those uh, in some cases extreme right Republican policies, but they don't necessarily like the messenger in Trump. They think he's a buffoon or crass or all those things, any one of those things. So I thought I would look at, do voters want Republicans or Democrats in Congress? So I think that would reflect overall which policies they prefer in general. And right now, that's sitting at Democrats plus 0.3. So that's a dead heat right there. Democrats 46.1 to Republicans 45.8. And that had been a bigger lead for Democrats in September. That was as high as 2.6%. So I don't know what happened there, but the gap has certainly closed. Democrats losing a little bit of support over these last weeks. And so that is virtually a tie there. And then one other thing before I'll hand it over to you is looking at mail-in and early votes. So it's pretty impressive what we've seen so far. Almost 62 million mail-in and early person votes cast nationally, with 41% of those coming from registered Democrats, 40% coming from registered Republican, and 19% other. They have a breakdown by state here, and I think some of the key states, of course, would be Pennsylvania, where you have 1.6 million ballots cast so far, with 58% coming from Democrats, 32% coming from Republicans. North Carolina is another crucial state where they've cast 3.6 million ballots, so double what Pennsylvania has cast so far, and Republicans are at 34% to Democrats 33%, with 33% being other, so large independent contingent there. And then just take a quick look at Michigan, 2.4 million ballots cast, Democrats at 47% of those, Republicans 42%. And let's just take a quick look at Wisconsin really quick. 1.2 million ballots cast so far, with actually other leading with 41% of those ballots, Democrats with 35%, and Republicans casting 24% of those ballots. So overall, outside of a few red states in the plains states like Wyoming, South Dakota, Idaho, Montana, for example, where they're mostly Republican anyway, and in the South, like the deep South, Louisiana, Arkansas, Tennessee, South Carolina, etc., a lot of the important swing states, we have an advantage uh, with Democrats casting more early ballots. So I don't know what that means. Most of the pollsters that I listen to in podcasts or videos, they talk about how it's really hard to to infer anything from that. But one other quick stat here before I throw it over: 63.3 million mail-in and early person votes requested nationally, with 44% of those being Democrat and only 30% being Republican, with 26% being independent. So in terms of who out there has actually requested these ballots, a 14% lead for Democrats there. And as a lead, maybe that's not the right word, but 14% more, or 14 points more than the Republicans. So that one thing that might tell me is that with a basic tie in terms of who's actually cast their early ballots so far, that means there's probably a lot of additional Democrats that have requested those ballots, but just haven't mailed them in yet or returned them to the drop box. So if Democrats already have a pretty significant early vote turn-in lead in some of those key swing states, and a lot of them haven't even voted yet, but they've requested those early ballots. That means there's still cream on the top there. So I think that is, if anything, is a good sign. At least that's how I would interpret that. Any thoughts there?
As usual, a plethora of information to start. um,
Yeah, and I can quote back any stats if you want me to remind you of any of
yeah,
the numbers.
I might. I was frantically writing, but I might need. Yeah, I might need a little bit there.
Of course.
Yeah. What was real quick? What was the Trump favorable, unfavorable? I know you said it was -8.7, but I didn't catch the numbers.
Trump unfavorable 52, and I'm just going to round off here.
Sure.
Trump unfavorable 52, favorable 43.5.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So a lot of thoughts, I guess. Where to start? One thing I keep hearing is, you can tell, who voted early by registration, but not necessarily how they voted.
Correct.
So that those could swing one way or another. So it's hard to, like you said, it's hard to take too much from that. I guess the biggest question. Well, let me say something else on that note. So I know historically, Democrats tend to vote more early, more mail in.
Yep.
I know Trump's been encouraging more people to get out and vote for him early. I still not think not encouraging the mail-in so much, but to at least get out and physically vote early. So it's interesting if that's the case. That's might be what's evening up a lot of those numbers initially, but the requested vote would probably go, like you said, more towards the mail, not male biological, but the U.S. mail
Yeah.
side. So there it looks like, like you said, it would look like Democrats maybe still have some advantage on that side. Those sometimes get counted later, so that leads to that whole, and I think that maybe is what Trump's going for. Like last time he was like, oh, I was leading on election night, and then the next morning all of a sudden I wasn't winning, which, I think you and I talked the other day outside of the podcast that a lot of states can take up to 3 days to actually certify everything. And there's a reason for that because counting takes time.
Yep.
Right. It's, and heck, half the time when you see it you're watching any of the cable networks and stuff, sometimes they're calling the state for somebody with a surprisingly low percentage of the votes actually in.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that's sometimes I'm always amazed when they do it, and I'm looking. It's like, man, that doesn't seem like a lot of votes.
Yeah.
Are in yet to even be trying to make that call. So,
Yeah.
So there, I mean, you always know those numbers are gonna move around a little bit, but
Well,
it seems like
another funny thing, super quick, is that a lot of states still don't have the legislation in place to allow them to count those mail-in votes early. Like they're literally collecting them, but they're just sitting there
Yeah.
until election day. And I'm shocked that there hasn't been an update to the laws in those states. And I think probably for unfortunately nefarious reasons, but why not have it in place where as the votes come in, obviously you don't report on the totals. You don't want to sway the election any in one direction, but just count them as they come in and put them in the system. And then that way you have a huge part of your job done.
Yeah.
And that way you're just focusing on late ballots that come in via mail or drop and then the in-person voting. I'm surprised that isn't just the standard across the country, honestly. But again, I think that's probably on purpose and probably for not the right reasons, if I'd have to guess.
Wasn't that the situation in Pennsylvania last time around? Was that they couldn't even start counting the mail-ins till that night, and then that led to yeah. You think
So they made the changes in the law so that it would open it up for during COVID to make it easier to vote through mail and drop-ins and stuff like that. But then they didn't adjust the counting procedures.
Yeah. The earlier you could count, the earlier you could give an accurate total. would be
Yep.
better. We could get away from all this, you know,
Days of uncertainty and
yeah,
stuff.
and
Yeah.
shenanigans that will ensue because of that.
Yep.
Um, what, I mean, I'm trying to kind of get my head around why, as I pay attention to the world as much as I can, different inputs. I'm sure some people would argue that too many of my inputs are, maybe left leaning versus the opposite. But the things I'm seeing, I'm trying to get my head around why these numbers would be tightening up closer to the election. Like
Yeah.
you're right. Harris did have came out to a big jump when she first, became the nominee, I think, or even the proposed nominee before the convention. But I think a lot of that was, I think she solidified the left a bit, right? A lot of the Democratic voters, because a lot of them weren't feeling so hot about Biden. There was uncertainty on the whole, and I think there still is some on the whole, maybe Palestinian Israel conflict. Some of
Yeah.
that she's seen. Go
She's just
ahead.
given lip service to that and hasn't really made them feel heard. I would say is probably the best way to say that. Not having a Palestinian voice at the DNC, not meeting with the uncommitted voter coalition, just I think missed opportunities there for sure on her side. And I think that is potentially going to hurt somewhat especially in Michigan, for example, because there's a large contingent of Muslim American and Palestinian American voters in that state.
So I hear that a lot, but I mean, when I sit back and I think about it, does that mean, to me, that means those people are staying home?
Right.
That
That's what I
doesn't,
would say.
yeah, that doesn't
Right.
mean those people are going to Trump, because what exactly incentive has he given for them to go that direction? I mean, the very first thing he did when
Right.
he got
Very
into
little.
office was propose a Muslim ban,
Right.
right? You can't tell me they've forgotten that. I know a few
I
people that
would
were
hope not. Yeah.
greatly affected by that when it was in place, who were trying to travel at the time
Mm-hmm.
and caught in other countries because they couldn't get
Yep.
home. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Yeah, so I find it hard to believe that those are necessarily swinging the other direction, as much as I would believe those are just people who could just sit it out. I would hope when
Yeah.
they're weighing both sides of it, they still might have more hope coming over to the Harris side, but it's hard
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think it's still important for Democratic lawmakers to continue to speak out with their own personal take on that, because if nothing else, it shows, Rashida Tlaib and AOC and some of those other folks that are a little more on the progressive side. Hopefully it's still getting the message out there that a lot of Democrats actually care about that issue and could hopefully have some sway maybe with Harris if she becomes president. Whereas on the Republican side, they're all neocon warhawks and they're all like staunchly pro-Israel, and they've taken so much APAC money that it's ridiculous. And so they are all in on that cause and providing Israel all the money and bombs that it wants. And they'll happily go to war against Iran with Israel, just pointing the finger and having us do the fighting. And that's what I see long term if the Republicans take control. So, yeah, so I think it's important to continue to still hear from those voices in the Congress that are sympathetic to the Palestinians and are anti genocide. So, yeah.
I mean, I certainly won't claim to be an expert in that area. I know you follow it a little closer than I do, but like, isn't,
Mhm.
and then please set me straight if I'm wrong on this, but isn't Israel kind of, he's they're poking at Iran right now,
Oh,
right? I
yeah.
mean, I know there's always tensions over there, but it feels like they've kind of taken the support they've gotten from us in this whole Israel Palestine or Gaza conflict, and then we're like, okay, well, we'll take that support and we'll slide over here and we'll just poke at Iran, because it looks like, it's such a hot button issue over here that we'll kind of try to force their hand. Am I close on that, or?
Yeah. Yeah. That's what a lot of I would say the consensus thinking is that I've listened to is that they've already killed almost 3,000 people in Lebanon. They've assassinated enemies in Tehran. Like they've literally gone into a sovereign country in Iran's capital and assassinated a Hamas leader. They've been doing successful strikes against Iranian military targets. and Iran has struck as well. So it appears that they're only going after military targets too within Israel. So at least for now, it feels like, I'm not going to say stable because that's not the right word, but it seems like tensions aren't ramping up drastically, but it feels like that's the direction we're going. And Biden just put a bunch of troops over in the area. We've got the Fifth Fleet sitting off the coast, basically. So there are U.S. military personnel and equipment and assets in that area. So if anything hits them, then, oh, hey, look at that. A convenient excuse to, go to full blown war. So I think it's a huge mistake. And I think we should be handling that whole situation differently. But I don't want to spend the entire podcast talking about that. But yeah, I'd say you're pretty darn right on that. Pretty close.
Well, thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
for the details there.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of back to what I was saying though, that like, her Harris's lead seemed to really be, like you said, it jumped in kind of the August, September timeframe when she had a lot of momentum behind her. I just, the things I see, I just find it hard to believe that, people are shifting back. I mean, I think we just have to listen to the two speeches, from Madison Square Garden and then from the Ellipse in the last couple of days to kind of know what kind of people we're talking about here. And I
Yeah.
don't know. I know there's a lot of people out there taking a lot of different information, and so they believe different things. We had a whole conversation about critical thinking and belief, a few
Mm-hmm.
podcasts back. But like, I just, like I said, I'm really struggling to understand how that's closing up. And I'll say, I wonder how many, when you think about the nature of polling, how many young Harris voters are maybe out there unaccounted for, kind of like that, like you were saying, the closeted Trump voters in 2016.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's a kind of an ace up the sleeve that the Democrats have, is that contingent of young voters that aren't really as active in politics necessarily, but they kind of read the room and they go by vibes. And I think anyone watching even just one speech from each candidate would kind of tell you which way that most young people would go, I think. Um,
Well, at least
so
female, right?
for
The whole
sure,
female
female.
issues. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of talk.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk that Trump has support among younger males.
Mm-hmm.
The whole, you hear a lot of talk about the whole, bro crowd and the, bro podcast, and he just did Rogan,
Yeah.
and then Vance was on Rogan recently too, I think, and Kamala's gotten out on some of the podcast tour, but not necessarily some of the same audiences. And I think she could have really benefited from going on Rogan, because I
Yeah.
think he would have asked her tougher questions than he did Trump, but I think she would have had answers. And I think
Yeah.
that long format that he does, where it's more of a conversation, she'd have more ability to say what she wants to say versus, a short interview soundbite format where maybe she does struggle to say what she wants to say in less
Yeah.
words and needs to be able to articulate some things a little bit. I think that could have benefited her. Go ahead.
Yeah. The only thought there is that I don't know if she's super good at those sort of long form, kind of non talking point kind of conversations yet. I think she's still finding her feet there. I mean, I know she got better at the 60 minutes interview type of format, and over time, and started doing more and more of those and doing local radio, and heard a lot of clips from those types of events. But I honestly don't know. I mean, it feels like she mostly does bring things back around to talking points. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I mean, that's very standard politician stuff. So I just don't know if she's super comfortable, if that would have benefited her. I agree the audience should have an opportunity to hear her, and I think that would have, on balance, been a good move to do Rogan. But I don't know if it would go quite as well as you think it would.
Well,
It just that was my initial thought
yeah,
on that.
no, I hear you. I think what I'm thinking of though is, Rogan doesn't. It's not really an interview. It's a
Right.
conversation, and
Yeah.
some of it would have been on policy. Not really. I personally don't think he's really all that into the policies of it. I think there's some
Right.
things.
He doesn't do any research and stuff ahead of time. You can tell
A
that.
little bit. I mean, he does have
I
a
mean,
producer that at least looks stuff up for
he's
him on
got
the
his
fly.
producer.
You know what I
Sure.
mean? But
Sure.
where I'm going is like I don't know if you did get a chance to go back and listen to it, but I know I referred to this in another podcast, but she did the All the Smoke podcast with
Yeah, I
former
took that one
basketball
up.
players, and got
Yep.
into her background a little bit more, and stuff she liked, music she liked when she was a kid, and I saw more kind of you got to see the human side of her a little
hmm
more, I think,
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
and
That's a good
I
point.
think that conversation would have brought a lot of that out, and you would have
Yeah.
got to know her as that. And I'm not here to, I'm not here to dispute every fact of when exactly she worked at McDonald's or not, or any of that, stuff that seems to be the hot topic. But I still believe there's a person there who came from a middle class, at best, single parent background, and I see the same thing in Tim Walz, and I don't see the same thing in Donald Trump. I see in JD Vance a guy who maybe did have that middle class, upbringing, but got away from it as fast as he could, which is fine. Okay, good, be successful. But I feel a lot of insincerity in his trying to swoop back to it. You know what I mean? So I mean, I know whose stories right now are resonating a lot more with me. You know what I mean? When it comes to who I think can relate to the things I care about when it comes when it's time for me to go to the ballot box.
Yep.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's also a good point. And I also think it's funny how Trump, two of his three wives are immigrants. JD Vance's wife, her family's an immigrant. He's got a blended family of different ethnicities. So it's just so funny that that's all they do is just demonize immigrants and talk shit about that group and those, punch down on those minority communities when it's been
Yeah,
part of their lives
yeah.
for
As,
years.
immigrants, if you don't like, or if you don't like what they're saying, which you probably should not like what they're saying, but don't you? I mean, you even find the hypocrisy in it.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of something. Again, I always have to give I try not to pick on religion too much, but it's like that old like, well, geez, you're not supposed to get divorced, but it's okay that the people I know who I love got divorced because they had a good reason to, right? There's always like
Yeah.
this pass we want to give to the people who we know that didn't do the things they were supposed to do. To go, well, it's okay because I understand their story. You know what I mean? But all those other
hmm
people, hey, they need to do as as we say.
Yep.
It kind of feels like one of those things here with the example you gave.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Um, all right. So one more thing on the numbers for the election, and then we'll shift over and go over some of the things about what Trump has cost us in those 4 years when he was president. Looking at the consensus electoral map. So this is a composite of ratings by several forecasters. This is on the 270towin.com site. And right now they have essentially they rank states as safe, likely, or leans, and then toss up. So right now, Democrats are sitting at 226 with 191 electoral votes in the safe column, 34 in the likely column, and one in the leans column. I think that's that one little district in Nebraska that is separate from the rest of the state. And then Republicans are at 219 with 122 safe, 97 likely. So that leaves 93 votes coming in the toss-up category, which is Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, which of course are all the swing states. So just kind of updating you there. That looks about like how I would expect it right now. It's just we could rail against the electoral college for a long time, but it's just I think it's a joke how it automatically favors Republicans, and Democrats need to win by 4 or 5 percentage points in the national popular vote to secure an electoral college victory typically. So that's just unfortunate, and I think we need to get rid of the electoral college and just go with a national popular vote. But I also like how some of the states are starting to sign on to the the concept of whoever wins the national popular vote, that's who they assign their electoral votes to, not state by state. So that's a way to get around that electoral college without having to pass a constitutional amendment, which in this divided political uh, situation, we're never going to get that. So that would be a cool way to bypass that and actually have the true will of the people represented instead of some janky system that was set up way long ago. So anyway, so there's that. Any thoughts on that before we jump into the article?
Yeah, two thoughts. Mostly agree. I will say, though, I have heard some chatter recently about how the Electoral College may actually benefit the Dems this time around
Yeah.
because of, to an extent, because of Trump maybe gaining ground in both California and New York, but
Hmm.
because they're both, gaining ground in votes, but because they're both typically safely blue states, Dems will still get the electoral college votes no matter what. Where you could,
Hmm.
if you started to hear about those numbers going up, you'd hate to see, if it was popular vote, you got to be a little more careful with that. But it would get to you would be able to win on a true majority without, like you said, Dems having to have a built-in,
Yeah.
4 or 5 points or whatever it was. The other thing is, and I want to be careful with this one too. I think the electoral college, right or wrong in how it was set up, part of the intent was, set up at a time when people weren't as informed. At least partly because of newspapers were not even maybe barely a thing. Distribution of information was difficult, right?
Hmm.
And so you kind of had to have that idea that maybe somebody is going on and represent who pays attention, who's involved, goes and represents the people who otherwise, can't be as informed or can't be as involved. They're working the farmland and they're, doing things. And now, as I see, we're in an age of information more than ever, but a good portion of the electorate is addicted to bad information. It might be worthwhile to say, hey, let's have a group of really informed, knowledgeable people go continue to represent the people who, may not be taken in. I mean, what I feel is the best form of the information. But if those people were to act in a true representative fashion, it could be just as bad. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I hope that came out how I meant it to. Like, like we said, if the electoral votes still represented a side, then
Hmm.
we'd still be in a bad spot. But if they
Yeah.
just acted in a true professional fashion and represented issues and went and you didn't leave it up to the people as much, sometimes they argue we might be a little better off. But I don't know. That may be a stretch.
Yeah. Right. All right. So let's dive into the article. And the title was What Trump Has Cost Us: The Financial, Political, and Cultural Costs of Trump. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but I have them broken down into
Hey,
areas of
can,
financial costs.
can I throw
Yeah.
something out there real quick
Sure. Yeah.
for all you people who are listening? Joe mentioned at the beginning he puts the research in and he writes these articles as a part of his Substack. So this is hard work he's put in. And please go subscribe and pay attention to what he says. He puts a lot of hard work into this stuff and makes some great points. All right, go ahead.
All right, appreciate that. So yeah, so this is broken down into financial costs, political costs, and cultural costs. And so, there's actually, funny enough, more that I kind of designated as cultural costs, the stuff that's a little more squishy, but I think can still be detrimental in many cases. So I'll just go through a couple of the financial cost ones. He added 7.8 trillion to the debt. At the time, this equaled 25% of the entire debt, and also the debt to GDP ratio is the highest since World War II. In 2016, Trump said he could pay down our then 19 trillion debt over a period of 8 years, mainly from growth from his tax cut plans and some of the tariffs that he wanted to put in place and some trade deals that he wanted to renegotiate. And really, when you look at it over all time, Trump had the third biggest deficit growth after George W. Bush and Abraham Lincoln, whereas where Bush also passed massive tax cuts, but he started two wars, and so that's where the majority of his deficit increase went or came from. And then Lincoln, of course, had to pay for the Civil War. So really, for Trump bragging about, starting no new wars and doing all this and that to be the president of peace and stuff, which is just a joke. He still ended up managing to add almost $8 trillion to the debt. And so that was a big deal, of course, especially coming from the party of fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, can we talk about that one a little bit for a second?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah, I mean, you had the third biggest deficit with no wars started. I mean, that takes skill, right? I mean,
You
that's
got to be trying
yeah,
hard to do
you
that.
got to be like the type of businessman who filed for bankruptcy 6 times or something like that.
What?
I mean, spending money, like you have it. If you don't, you know what I mean?
Yep, yep.
And the idea, he argued he could pay it down with tax cuts and tariffs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so again, not an economist, but let me translate with my layman's understanding of that. Tax cuts are inherently add to the deficit because you're lowering your income,
Yep.
right? And if you don't cut your spending, which apparently he did not, then
Nope.
you're inherently adding to the deficit, to your debt. And tariffs, as we've heard of much of the conversation lately, are at the end of the day paid by us.
Mm-hmm.
So as the consumer, basically in the form of a sales tax, which is something that side's kind of argued for a long time, is we should have more sales tax, less income tax.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, so you're asking the lower and the middle classes to pay for the deficits because you're letting the upper class off the hook with, what was it, 85% of his tax cuts went to the like top few percent, and he still managed to, and he wanted us to pay for the third largest deficit in history with no wars even started.
Yeah.
Something don't seem right.
Yeah, that's not really adding up. Yeah, and one of the things that those tariffs did, this is another point in here, was that according to ProPublica, the tariff revenues were estimated to be about 36 billion more than under Obama. So when Trump did put his tariff regime in place, that's what the estimated increase in dollars coming into the government. But according to the Des Moines Time Register, the Trump administration gave around 26 billion of that back to farmers who had been hurt by his aggressive trade wars. So, here was an interesting quote I found. Basically he had to divert federal funds, federal revenue to make the farmers whole. And a quote from Mark Recker, who is the chairman of the Iowa Corn Growers Association board, said, "These mitigation payments, quote, these mitigation payments help temporarily, but they don't cover the long-term damage we're sustaining. It's hard to put a number on that, but it's a really big one," end quote. So these are other ways that, he said the tariffs were going to help with revenue, but he had to take some of that revenue and redistribute it back to farmers directly to make up for the revenue they were losing by not having those same markets overseas available to them, or with them having to pay enormous tariffs to, um, to compensate for our side of the trade war. So definitely not what it was sold as, for sure.
So this might be a controversial question, but when the Democrats want to have safety net programs and stuff, and I've heard this in the past, they're accused of trying to buy people's votes.
Mm-hmm.
When you give $26 billion back to farmers to make sure they're, and I understand the guy said there's still a lot of long-term damage associated, but when you give $26 million back, are you buying votes? Are you buying votes back that you might have otherwise lost?
I mean, some might say those farmers would be upset
I'm
if
just asking
their revenues
questions.
went down and all of a sudden someone swoops in and says, "Here's free money." Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. And then here's another fun one. Some of you may have heard about this, but will be the final one from the financial section. Is that Trump cost contractors, event spaces, police, and service providers by stiffing them and not paying his bills. Newsweek reported that a 2019 Center for Public Integrity report found that 10 different cities demanded over 840,000 in back payments for past rallies that they helped stage but hadn't been compensated by Trump for yet. And then even as of 2020, Trump had still not paid all of his bills from his failed Taj Mahal casino. Ultimately, he owed 253 contractors over $70 million. And then he was, when the Taj went bankrupt in 91, he was offering them only 33 cents on the dollar for the amounts they were still owed. And finally, this is a classic. Trump loves his lawsuits, but this is a staggering number. So USA Today did an analysis and found that Trump has been involved in more than 3,500 lawsuits, many of which are from contractors, vendors, and regular people who were stiffed by Trump or his companies. So, I mean, he's cost the country and he's cost many individual people and businesses and hardworking individuals who were excited to get a contract from Trump, but then he stiffed them. So that's been a constant story since he kind of came out of the shadows to post apprentice to get into the political limelight, and a lot of this stuff has been uncovered. But it's just shocking, these numbers, and the fact that he still owes a lot of these contractors and providers years later is just outstanding or astounding.
For all the people who want to make the argument that it's good to have him in there because he's a businessman, like what do these numbers tell you about what kind of businessman he is?
Right.
Stiffing people that he does business with. You know, I heard him at I forget which podcast I was listening to, but they played a clip of him complaining at a recent rally because he was like there was like a fly. You know, they were outside and there was like bugs and stuff. Which I know he's had other rallies outside, so you know, I don't know. Maybe it's kind of an anomaly, but he was basically complaining that he couldn't be indoors at some of the places that he wanted to be. Also, he wanted to be indoors more now for his protection after the assassination attempts. But a lot of venues don't want to let him in because of some of these numbers you rattled off because he won't pay the bill. And I remember hearing in several places, and you know, again, apologies, I don't have documentation, but like numerous times where he'll go into like a restaurant and be like, "Hey, everybody, it's on me, the whole place."
Claims casino on for everyone in the house.
Yeah, and then walks out the door and leaves the restaurant holding the tab because he doesn't actually pay.
Yep.
So, anyway, there's your businessman.
Right. Right. If that's how he treats, the people that he's supposed to be entering in relationships with, contractual relationships with, again, what does that say about how he actually treated the American people?
So then on the back end of that, you hear about how litigious he is, right? Constantly suing, constantly defending himself on stuff. You know, probably in a lot of these cases, and I'm speculating here, but potentially countersuing. You know what I mean? Or the sort of, I don't know what the correct term is, but like pre-suing. You know what I mean? To kind of starting the litigation to avoid having to pay a lot of this stuff. Who knows what he pays in legal fees? Of course, there's another case where you always hear about him stiffing people on the bill is lawyers. How many lawyers has he gone through in some of his various legal troubles as he's been president because he doesn't pay his bills?
Yeah, poor Rudy Giuliani, for example. That I hesitate to say poor Rudy Giuliani because I think he brought it all on himself. But he's like still all in on Trump, and Trump owes him a bunch of money, and he's not paying it. And Giuliani literally has nothing now. He's been bankrupted into the dirt, and
yeah, because he's had to turn around and pay the 2 Georgia poll workers.
Yeah,
give up his apartment and all his stuff because of all the lies he told there
on Trump's behalf.
Yeah, on Trump's behalf, exactly.
Yep. Yeah, it's gross. So in the political side, there's just one main one that I wanted to call out here, although there are several. Maybe I'll summarize a couple of the other ones, but I think one of the big ones was essentially, if you follow the threads, he kind of cost us Middle East peace by ramping up the drone war after Obama, and then also enacting the Abraham Accords without Palestinians involved, partly leading to the October 7th Hamas attacks on Israel. Um, and in terms of drone strikes, according to the BBC, Trump revoked a policy that required U.S. officials to publish the number of civilians killed in drone strikes. So he was trying to hide how many civilians were being killed when he was increasing his drone strikes. Um, he launched, or Obama launched, 186 drone strikes on Yemen, Somalia, and especially Pakistan during his first 2 years in office. In 2017 and 2018 to date, that was through November of 18, Trump has launched 238 drone strikes there. So Trump dramatically increased the number of drone strikes. In 2017, Trump launched 130 drone strikes in Yemen alone, and that was to help Saudi Arabia, who was in a war with the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So that was more than 3 times the number from 2016. And of course, we all know that Trump's heavy involvement with the Saudis, which includes $2 billion given by the Saudis to his son-in-law Jared Kushner. To me, that kind of shows that he may have had ulterior motives for those strikes. It wasn't just for national security interests; it was to throw a favor to the Saudis, who love to have our drones flying around Yemeni airspace and trying to kill Houthis. So for them. So that was pretty gross. And like I said, with the Abraham Accords, without having Palestinians involved, that was cited as part of the reason why Hamas did that attack on October 7th. So, if you ignore people that have been put in open air prisons for over 50 years and are struggling to survive day to day, then yeah, if you leave them out of the conversation, they might get a little mad by that. So I'm not justifying the attack at all. I'm not trying to say that I have zero support for Hamas, and I just want to make that very clear. But I also want to say that the facts show that the Abraham Accords partly led to that October 7th attack. So
you can't ignore the contributing factors.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And
exactly.
That's interesting, the Abraham Accord piece, because to our conversation just earlier in this episode about whether Palestinian Americans are going to go Harris, Trump, or stay home, that's another piece of the puzzle to me that says they probably, if they don't go Harris, they stay home.
Yeah.
If they're knowledgeable about that, that fact, because right there, he didn't include you in the deal for Middle East peace, that he loves to tout that they solved Middle East peace, right? Nobody's ever been able to do this before. Yeah. So there's that. There's very interesting stats on the drone strikes. I can't help but think back to a couple other things. You had the time where he dropped the Moab, right, the mother of all bombs, I think, in Afghanistan. Yep. There was the killing of the Iranian leader. I can't think of his name offhand, but
Qasem Soleimani.
Yeah.
I think.
Yep. Exactly. The assassination of that
in Syria. Yeah. He was on the ground fighting ISIS.
Yeah.
And Trump assassinated him.
Yeah. And then along with the Saudi Arabia conversation, you got the whole Jamal Khashoggi murder.
Mm-hmm.
Which basically Trump said, "Okay, no big deal. Thanks. Yeah. Please give my son-in-law $2 billion. Yeah, very interesting stats. Yeah. Very interesting pieces of information. And we're bringing all this up, right, as a reminder. These things all happened, guys. Again, like we kind of touched on at the beginning, everybody wants to remember this rosy 4 years that when Trump was president, a lot of bad stuff happened.
Absolutely. Just a couple other quick summaries. So he cost us a strong bipartisan border law because Trump wanted to run on a politically advantageous issue for Republicans instead of helping to solve a real world problem. Cost us our standing and respect in the world with things like the Muslim ban. He pushed other world leaders out of the way for photo ops. He cozied up to Vladimir Putin and had private meetings with him and his diplomats. Took an isolationist approach, threatened funding for NATO, which would basically tank NATO. And then, of course, cost us overturning of 50 years of precedent of women's reproductive rights. So, as well as the overturning of the Chevron doctrine, um, creating his Supreme Court created presidential immunity from whole cloth, where he got to appoint 3 of the 9 justices. So, just a lot of terrible stuff there. So, jumping into cultural costs really quick. Um, I think this is a big one here. Cost us hundreds of thousands of additional preventable deaths in 2018 alone. The Lancet report, a Lancet report shows that in 2018, if the United States death rate had been equivalent to other G7 nations, then could have avoided over 400,000 deaths just that year. And that was even pre-COVID. And then also, thanks to Trump's aggressive deregulation drive, particularly around pollution, water quality, and other environmental policies, there were 22,000 extra deaths just in 2019. And then during COVID, the Lancet also estimated that the U.S. could have prevented 40% of the total deaths under Trump. His politicization and dismissal of many public health experts' recommendations and warnings led to a dismal response to the pandemic, resulting in hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. So I think that's a big one that is just unforgivable. That was completely politicized and turned into a clown show when people's lives were on the line. So that's something that I could never forgive him for.
Yeah, the whole COVID thing, especially because I remember I was paying close attention to everything during those times, and he just didn't know how to handle it. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
know how to, and fully acknowledge it's an unprecedented thing. But I think instead of having surrounded himself with a good team of people, like it's said to Biden or Obama did, especially, and I think Biden has a tendency to do too. Um, he's got Jared Kushner and his college buddies running the trying to get equipment. He
Mm-hmm.
brings in the people he likes versus actually talented, qualified people to do some of these things, and it shows in his response to things. We talked about the PPP in another podcast that was greatly taken advantage of by
Yeah.
both by all ends of the spectrum, but still just a completely poorly run program. And I remember, uh, I think back to during the Ebola situation under Obama, and he had the person he had run that was Biden's ended up being Biden's first chief of staff, Ron Klain,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember hearing stories about that, and Ron Klain was like, Obama calls me in and says, "I want you to handle you know this Ebola situation," and Ron's like, "Well, I'm not a medical person. I don't know anything about these. I don't need a medical person. I need somebody to coordinate and manage all the pieces parts to make
Yeah.
sure that this operation runs effectively and get the experts doing the right things at the right time and figure out what we need to do." And that's the kind of thing you need when situations like that come up. And that's clearly what we did not have under the Trump administration. And like you said, the first opportunity he got, he politicized it. Tom
Mm-hmm.
Hartman did some great coverage of that. Where as soon as it came out that um, that blacks and Hispanics and were going to be more heavily affected, he pulled back. He started to pull back the effort to get supplies and stuff, and started to say, governors, you're on your own, and make it a
Yeah.
whole blue state, red state thing, and not
Mm-hmm.
worry as much about minorities. And again, that's not me saying this. People go look it up. Tom Hartman report did some great. Has talked about that many times. You know what I
Yep.
mean? And I guess what really jumps out to me and what you said there is 400,000 in 2018. Like what was that even? Did they give any information on what those deaths were likely from? Like what was
Well,
the situation?
I mean, so there was the talk of 2019 where it was around his cutting of regulations around pollution and water quality and other things like that specifically led to those deaths. So I think that's part of the 2018. Also, it's not, I should be clear too that it wasn't just starting in like 27 or 2018. It was worse in the Trump years, but there was also a discrepancy between G7 average death rates um, prior to the Trump administration too. It just exacerbated that during the Trump years. So I think that's a combination of all the various policies and things that he had, and then just again comparing the United States death rate to G7 countries. So yeah, I
Gotcha.
think it's a
Okay.
little bit of everything. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, great stuff. If I could go back to the list, and I know you want to finish up here, but 50 years of precedent with Roe. I hear a lot of chatter out there that like some people think that like Biden was responsible for that situation
Mm-hmm.
because it happened during the Biden presidency.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned the Supreme Court justices. That happened because Donald Trump was able to appoint three Supreme Court justices, including one in the last, at the last minute, like in the last couple weeks before the election, where conversely, well, okay, so that was the third of the three. The first of the three he got to
Mm-hmm.
appoint because Mitch McConnell in the Senate held up the appointment of Merrick Garland, who Obama appointed, what was it, 9 months before the
Yeah.
2016 election? After,
Uh-huh.
was it Antonin Scalia? Was that when he
Yep.
passed?
Yep.
So the Republicans held up the appointment for 9 months because it wouldn't be right to do it right before an election, which slid that choice into Trump's term. He got to appoint, that was not Kavanaugh, who was the one before that.
Was it Gorsuch
Gorsuch,
first?
yeah, Gorsuch.
Yep.
Then he got to appoint Kavanaugh, and then at the last minute, he got to slide Amy Coney Barrett in. All three of which said that Roe was settled precedent, and they had no interest
Mm-hmm.
and no desire to overturn it. And then the second the case, which people knew was coming up through the pipeline, got to the Supreme Court, boom, Roe is gone. So don't buy any of that bullshit that it happened under, it's Biden's fault because it happened under Biden. No, it was all put in place by not only Trump, but Mitch McConnell and all the
Mm-hmm.
Republicans all the way up through the line. So people, just make sure your facts are straight on that piece when,
Mm-hmm.
if you care about that issue.
Yeah. Good point. Very good point. All right, so we'll wrap up quick with, I guess, just my final thoughts on the election and my big hope. And this is all this is a hope. Is that just like there were the closet Trump voters in 2016 who weren't comfortable coming out and saying they supported him, but they wanted to change candidate. They were sick of the establishment. They wanted something different, and Trump was that for them. He didn't have a track record yet, so they were willing to give him a chance. I think what my hope is that this year it's kind of the other way around, where you've got a lot of people that are on the fence about Kamala, at least publicly, not too sure about her. But really, when it comes down to it, there's going to hopefully a lot of people that will, at the end of the day, fill in that little circle for Harrison Walls because they just can't take a chance on another Trump 4 years. And we just went through a small handful of the costs of Trump in his 4 years in that article I wrote. And there are probably many more that I didn't even cover. And we all know that Trump's rhetoric has been ramping up since then. His mental acuity and cognition has been going downhill since then. So here's a man who has fewer inhibitions, who has the Project 2025 waiting in the wings, written by many of his former staff and supporters. And he's not going to take a chance on appointing anybody who's not a 100% loyalist yes man. So
No
what we
checks and
saw in 20,
balances, right? No
right,
checks and balances on him this
zero,
time.
zero. So we saw how bad it was for those 4 years when you really break it down. And then I think another 4 years would be way worse. And so I'm hoping that those people at the last minute, even if they were thinking about supporting him, will just wise up and say, we can't take a chance. I have to vote for Harrison Walls. And we've got to push this through so we have an administration that will not threaten democracy, will not set the military against our own citizens, will not rip out whole departments in the federal government at the roots, et cetera, et cetera. So
Will
that's
not
what I'm
steal
really
all of our
hoping.
national security documents and then have what we've heard, 7 phone calls with Putin since he's not been in
Yeah,
office.
yeah.
I'm just connecting some dots there. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, yeah, we could go on and on about the really scary, troubling things that
Civilly
have
convicted
happened. So,
of rape, sexual assault, and defamation. A pending trial for, like we said, the stolen documents for inciting an
yeah.
insurrection on January 6th, who
Mm-hmm.
he basically admits to now by referring to the people that were storming the Capitol as we, as the people on
Mm-hmm.
his side. I think that's an
Mm-hmm.
admission of guilt. Sorry, I know I keep
Yep.
interrupting. You want to wrap up?
And well, yeah, no, and his 34 felony counts that he has been convicted of, and is just awaiting sentencing in the end of November. So, I mean, if you want to take a chance with that, I don't understand it, but I'm hoping that there are enough people out there that just say at the last minute, we just can't take that chance. So,
But this is America, and you're free to vote as you please.
yeah.
But please respect the vote of everyone, and
Mm-hmm.
trust the process, because Trump hired a guy in 2020 to be in charge of that Chris Krebs to be in charge of election integrity, and he says there was no problems. The courts say there was no problems, so stop buying into all the internet BS. If you think you have evidence that there was manipulation, and they've been claiming voter fraud. The Republicans have been claiming voter fraud in the national election for like 5 or 6 straight elections back
Mm-hmm.
in time, and they've never been able to find any. They've appointed Republican commissions after some of the 2016, 2012, to find the supposed voter fraud that they say is out there, and they've never been able to actually find any. Just
Yep.
please take that into consideration as you head into the polls. You're free to vote for who you want, but please respect everybody's vote. That it matters, and let the will of the people stand.
Yep. All right. Well said. I think that's where we'll end it. So, all right, everybody. We will talk to you again after the election. We'll plan on recording a follow up episode for release after the election, and hopefully everything turns out the way we want it to. If not, then I guess we'll go from there. So, with that, we'll call it good. All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and go out and vote. Make your voice heard. Do what you got to do. All right. Take care.